The doorbell didn't ring so much as pierce the night, a single chime that felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. 1 second earlier I'd been rinsing teacups, watching steam curl up like little prayers. The next I knew without knowing how, that my life had just been split into a before and an after. My name is Elena Madu, and if you'd asked me yesterday what made a family, I would have said kindness, history, the shared language of inside jokes. I would have pointed to our weathered blue house on Maple Quay, where my husband Jonah left his boots by the back door and our boy Mika taped baseball cards to the fridge. I would have told you about Sunday paella nights and muddy footprints and the tiny pencil marks on the hallway wall where we measured Mika's height every spring. That was my proof. That was my sermon. Jonah and I had been together 14 years. The kind of love that looked ordinary from the outside and brilliant from within. He was 38, a civil engineer who could turn spreadsheets into bridges and could talk about lures and tides as if fish had calendars. His real obsession, though, was us. Mika was 11 and curious about everything. Comets, curveballs, why onions make us cry. He still believed I could untangle any knot. We owned a small loft in downtown Harborview, something Jonah's grandmother left him. We didn't need it. So when my younger sister Lila and her husband Trent said they were saving for a place, we handed them the keys and told them to breathe. No rent. No strings. Because that's what I thought family did. You hold the door open, you make space, you root for one another. If I replay that night, I can see the moment naive faith cracked. The way the streetlights spilled over the porch, the shadow of two strangers behind the peephole, my hand hovering above the knob. I could feel my future rearranging itself on the other side of that door, like furniture dragged across a floor I hadn't agreed to change. The day had started with laughter. Jonah and Mika moved through the kitchen like a two-man parade, loading rods, bickering about bait, riffing on who would catch the legend of Cinder Bay. They had a ritual for fishing mornings. Hot chocolate for Mika with a cinnamon stick he pretended was a cigar, thermos coffee for Jonah, 3 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and a mint tucked beneath each napkin like a secret. They kissed my cheek, promised to be home by 6 because homework waits for no trout, and vanished into bright winter air. I scrubbed the counters, folded towels that still smelled like sunlight, and hummed to the hum of the washing machine. Ordinary happiness. At 5 I started a stew, tasting and retasting the broth as if seasoning could summon them. By 6:30 I checked the clock. By 7 I called Jonah and it went straight to voicemail. Cinder Bay is famous for swallowing cell signals, so I told myself a story. They lost track of time. They saw something beautiful. Maybe the truck wouldn't start. I kept ladling broth I couldn't swallow. The chime of the doorbell at 8:51 felt wrong. Too formal for neighbors, too late for deliveries. 2 officers stood beneath the porch light, hats in their hands, faces arranged in that careful practiced sorrow that says, "We have done this before and it never gets easier." Sergeant Alvarez asked if he could come in. Officer Klein lingered at the threshold as though the air itself might break. They sat. I didn't. I remember the way the clock ticked, a metronome for grief, while Alvarez searched for a gentler word that didn't exist. He found a cruel one instead: collision. An impaired driver. A red light ignored. Old Mill Parkway, 5 miles from Cinder Bay. I asked the only question that mattered. Are they alive? Jonah, he said, was gone at the scene. I heard nothing else for a moment. The sound fell out of the world like a trapdoor. Then a rope of words found me. Mika. Critical. Airlifted. Surgery. North Mercy Medical Center. I remember tasting metal and realizing I'd bitten my lip. I remember the way my knees trembled and refused to fail. I remember saying, "Take me to my son," and meaning, take me to the part of my life you have not yet taken. Hospitals at night feel like planets with their own weather. Officer Klein drove. I kept my eyes on the dash lights as if numbers could anchor me. Fluorescent corridors critiqued every human face, exposing the places sorrow thins us out. The surgical waiting room was painted a gentle green that failed at its job. A vending machine blinked like a small, indifferent city. Dr. Hannah Saito met me with hands she kept clasped, as if even her fingers were bracing for impact. She talked to me the way people speak to someone standing on a ledge, plain, slow, without metaphors. Mika had a traumatic brain injury. They were working to relieve pressure. They had stabilized what they could. "We won't know about neurological function for some time," she said. "Minutes, hours, days. It's impossible to promise." I nodded as if this were a business meeting and I was taking notes. When they let me see him, I stopped being brave. My boy looked smaller than the bandages, as if the white had overwhelmed the child beneath. Machines breathed in blue sounds. Numbers spooled and dipped, quiet, relentless choreography I didn't know the steps to. I touched the only place on his hand not webbed with tape and whispered, "I'm here. I'm here," because repetition felt like a rope I could pull us both along. In the slippage between midnight and morning, I called my parents. Hector answered, then passed the phone to Maureen, who sighed like she had been woken for a minor nuisance. Rain against a window, a dog barking 2 doors down. I told her about the crash. I told her Jonah was dead. I told her our baby was fighting in the type of sleep you don't wake from without permission. She said they would come after breakfast. They arrived in cardigans, flinched at the antiseptic, looked at their watches like somewhere else was calling them. They stayed an hour, said, "We'll help with arrangements," and went home to sleep in their unbroken house. I learned that night what all the counselors say: grief is loud even when you don't make a sound. It rattles the glass in your ribs. It stains the air. It waits by the elevator with its arms folded and follows you back to your child's bed. Morning came with a clipboard. There is nothing quite as obscene as paperwork on the day you lose your language. A funeral director's card curled in my palm like a pressed leaf. I called anyway. I chose programs and hymns and a casket with a satin lining I could barely look at. When I asked my parents to help, their voices turned to fog. Lila and Trent, they said, were moving into the downtown loft this week. They had promised to help them settle. "We'll be at the service," my mother said, "but we can't do the planning." I hung up and stared at the phone as if it might apologize. I did it all myself. Flowers that smelled like 100 different kinds of goodbye. Photos on easels. Jonah laughing with his head thrown back. Mika in a cap too big for him. The 3 of us arm-wrapped and sunburned on a pier in Gull Point. Our neighbors came. Jonah's co-workers came. People who had once borrowed sugar came, and it felt like a revelation. Sometimes community isn't a noun. It's a verb people do when you're drowning. The loft, the house, the savings. Jonah had been the kind of careful that feels like love disguised as spreadsheets. The bank accounts and life insurance meant I could step back from my accounting job and measure my days by the rhythm of Mika's machines. I read him fantasies and fractions and the weather report to places we wanted to visit. I told him about shooting stars and the time his father fell into Cinder Bay up to his waist and came out grinning like he meant to do it. I said, "You're allowed to rest. You're also allowed to come back." He didn't squeeze my hand. The monitors kept their aloof waltz. Nurses who had learned our names started leaving cinnamon candies beside my chair. Kindness is like stitches that hold you together just enough to keep walking the corridor. I went home each night to a house with only one set of boots by the back door. I washed cups that belonged to nobody. I folded a child's shirts that had forgotten the shape of his shoulders. I told myself this was a bridge. I told myself bridges go somewhere. Time can turn into a ritual if you let it. Mornings at the office dwindled into a part-time tether I barely felt. Afternoons at North Mercy were my new calendar. I learned the nurse's shift changes, the exact hiss of the sanitizer, the place in the window where light made a fragile halo over Mika's blanket at 4:17. I learned to bargain with the ceiling. Take my breath but give it to him. Take my sleep but give him a little more. Lila and Trent texted now and then, emojis stacked like confetti, a cartoon thumbs up glued to a thinking of you. They loved the loft, they said, the exposed brick, the way the city sounded alive at midnight. They never asked how Mika was. My parents visited 3 times in 6 months, nervous as cats near thunder. "Hospitals unsettle me," my mother said, as if the building were the problem and not the fact that her grandson lay between worlds 1 floor up. I kept my anger in a jar and called it grace. When Dr. Saito said, "Touch and go," I set my chair closer and pretended my hand on our boy's wrist could teach his pulse to be stubborn. I read him the first chapters of books I promised we'd finish at home. I made lists of small miracles I'd accept. A finger twitch, an eyelash shiver, a dream he could tell me about later. I watched the door the way sailors watch horizons. On the 7th Tuesday of that waiting life, my phone lit with the hospital's number while I was balancing quarterly reports for a client who thought deadlines mattered. Dr. Sato's voice was careful, kind, and, this time, different. "Elena," she said, and the space after my name told the truth before the words could. "Can you come in right away?" The jar in my chest cracked. I grabbed my coat and ran the way a person runs when they don't believe feet can beat fate but will try anyway. The sky over Harborview was a hard, bright blue, and for one superstitious second I hated the sun for daring to shine. I drove faster than I prayed. I parked crooked. I pressed the elevator button with a ferocity that made the metal complain. The doors closed. In the mirrored wall, a woman looked back at me, older than yesterday, mouth set like a line drawn with a ruler, eyes that had forgotten how to blink. I whispered to her, to myself, to whatever listens in elevators, please. Just please. When I reached the ICU, the hallway smelled faintly of bleach and burnt coffee. Dr. Saito stood there, her posture a kind of apology before she even spoke. I could read it in her eyes. Doctors learn to compose themselves, but sorrow always leaks through the edges. Elena, she said softly, I'm so sorry. Mika passed about an hour ago. His body just couldn't fight anymore. The words weren't loud, but they detonated inside me. Passed. Couldn't fight. My child, my boy who believed I could fix anything, was gone. My knees bent of their own accord, my palms slammed against the cool wall, and the world tilted sideways. I demanded yesterday back. Just yesterday he had looked the same as always. Still breathing with the help of machines, but alive. I told myself stability was safety. But stability, it turns out, can be a lie. They let me in to hold him. His skin was warm, but the warmth was borrowed, a kindness left behind by the machines before they switched them off. His face was serene, like he was only pretending to sleep. I stroked his hair, whispered lullabies I hadn't sung in years, and prayed for a miracle I knew was already denied. Later I drove home on autopilot, tears blurring streetlights into smears of gold. I sat at my kitchen table until the night bled into dawn, the silence pressing harder than any scream. When I finally lifted the phone to call my parents, I expected shock, grief, even anger. What I got was something else entirely. Mom, I whispered into the receiver, Mika died today. Pause. Long enough that I thought the line had gone dead. Then her voice, flat and detached, Oh, Elena. I'm sorry to hear that. Sorry to hear that, like I had just told her a distant neighbor had lost their cat. I need help with the funeral, I begged. I can't do this alone again. Her sigh rattled down the line. That's going to be difficult. We're flying to Cancun with Lila and Trent tomorrow morning. The trip's been planned for months. For a moment I couldn't even form words. My son was dead and my family was debating hotel check-ins. You're telling me you'll choose a vacation over your grandson's funeral? My voice cracked into something half feral. Elena, we've already paid $8,000. The vouchers are non-refundable. You'll cope, you're strong. You managed Jonah's funeral just fine without us. She hung up before I could answer. Minutes later the phone rang again. It was Lila. Her tone was sharp, annoyed. Look, I'm sorry about Mika, but there's no way we're canceling this trip. I'm pregnant and this is my last chance to relax before the baby. His death is your problem, not mine. Those words. That cruelty. They burned hotter than the accident itself. I sat there staring at the silent phone, realizing with terrifying clarity, I was utterly alone. But loneliness, it seemed, could be fuel. I didn't wait for them. I didn't beg again. Instead I called my friend Marisol, a woman whose kindness had held me up more times than I could count. She came over within the hour, bringing folders, pens, and the steadiness I lacked. Together we planned a funeral. It was small, modest flowers, soft hymns, a pastor who spoke gently of reunions in heaven. Mrs. Doyle, Mika's teacher, drove an hour to be there, tears streaking down her cheeks as she read a poem he once wrote in class about stars. A handful of Jonah's coworkers came, remembering how Mika had tagged along to office picnics, always the kid who asked too many questions and made everyone laugh. I didn't cry during the service. I had already drowned in tears at home. Instead I felt strangely calm, as though grief had hollowed me into someone else entirely. When they lowered Mika's small casket beside Jonah's grave, I stood rigid, watching earth swallow wood, thinking of how my family was sipping cocktails on a beach in Mexico while I buried my world. That night I didn't collapse. I didn't shatter. Something harder rose inside me, cold and unyielding. They had abandoned me twice. First at Jonah's funeral, then at Mika's. This time I would not let it pass. After the last mourner left, I walked home in silence, unlocked my front door and made a decision. They had chosen their vacation. I would choose my freedom. The next morning I drove to the downtown loft. My key still fit, though the very sight of it now felt like betrayal. I opened the door to find Lila's shoes scattered on the mat, Trent's loud sports posters tacked to walls Jonah once painted himself. I didn't hesitate. Box by box, bag by bag, I packed every belonging: clothes, cookware, gaudy lamps, picture frames with their two perfect smiles. I worked with the efficiency of someone possessed, methodical and calm. In 3 hours their life was reduced to cardboard and plastic. Then I called a moving company, paid them extra to deliver everything to my parents' house, and instructed them not to bother with neatness. Dump it all in the living room, I said. Make it impossible to ignore. When they left I called a locksmith. New locks, new deadbolt, new knob. Their keys would turn useless in their hands. The loft was mine again, not a gift to those who had spat on the very concept of family. Driving home I didn't feel guilty. I felt lighter. As though every box removed from that loft was another stone lifted from my chest. That night I sat at my laptop with the determination of someone carving their own escape route. I logged into my bank accounts and began dismantling years of generosity. My parents' car insurance, cancelled. Their supplemental health plan, gone. The woodworking magazine my father adored but never paid for, ended. My mother's streaming service, the one she always asked me to renew, terminated. Then came Lila's luxuries. Her phone bill, her car payments, the gym membership I had once gifted her out of love. All cancelled. With every click I remembered why I had taken these expenses on in the first place. Dad's retirement making things tight. Lila unable to hold a job after college. The wedding gift that cost me thousands because I wanted her to feel cherished. Each memory cut deeper now because kindness had been met not with gratitude but with contempt. By the end, I realized I had been giving nearly $3,000 a month to people who couldn't even spare a moment for my son's funeral. As I shut the laptop my phone buzzed. Social media lit up with photos of them in Mexico, sun-drenched, smiling, cocktails in hand. Lila captioned one shot, "So grateful for family that always supports me." I screenshotted every post not for revenge but for memory. Proof of who they were. Proof of what they valued. And for the first time in months my mind was clear. I was no longer their safety net. I was no longer theirs at all. 3 days passed. I cooked meals for one, sorted through Mika's clothes with trembling hands, and ignored the phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. My family had returned from Mexico tan and rested, ready to step back into lives they thought I would continue funding. That Sunday evening the calls multiplied. First my mother, then my father, then Lila and Trent, voices spilling into my voicemail like broken glass. What happened to the loft? Why are our things here? Call us back immediately. I deleted every message without listening to the end. By 10 the pounding started. Fists against my front door, voices rising like a storm. Elena, open this door right now. Lila's voice, shrill with rage. I stood in my living room staring at the door. My pulse was steady, not frantic. 4 months I had lived in chaos, but that night clarity wrapped itself around me like armor. I opened the door. They stormed in, my parents stiff with irritation, Lila's cheeks red with fury, Trent shifting uncomfortably like he wanted to be invisible. They stood in my living room for against one, expecting me to fold. But grief had forged me into something harder. This time I would not bend. What the hell did you think you were doing? Lila demanded, fists clenched at her sides. Our stuff is thrown all over Mom and Dad's house like trash, and we can't even get into our apartment. I met her anger with calm. It's not your apartment anymore. I changed the locks. You're evicted. Her jaw dropped. You can't evict us. We have rights. It's my property, I said simply. I let you live there rent-free as a favor. That favor is over. Trent shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about finding a lawyer. My father tried to intervene. Elena, this isn't how family behaves. We've had our differences, but we can work through them. I almost laughed. Family. The word tasted rotten now. You should have thought about that before you told me my son's death was my problem, not yours, I said, my voice sharp but steady. Silence crashed down. Lila's eyes darted away. She remembered every cruel word. I was upset, she stammered. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. No, I said, you meant exactly what you said. You chose a vacation over your nephew's funeral. You chose comfort over compassion. For the first time since Jonah's accident, I felt like I was the one holding the power. Lila's face twisted into something ugly, venom dripping from her words. I know what this is really about. You're jealous because I'm having a baby and your son is dead. Even Trent flinched. My parents looked away, ashamed but silent. The room stilled into a suffocating silence. You've lost your mind because Mika died, she went on, and now you're punishing me because I'm moving on with my life. You can't stand that I'm happy while you're stuck grieving over a kid who wasn't even that special. The words sliced through me, sharp and deliberate. For a second my vision blurred, not from tears but from the icy rage that flooded every vein. Get out, I said, my voice low but final. No, she shrieked. I'm pregnant. You can't throw me out on the street. You should have thought about that before you spat on my son's memory, I replied, my voice steady as steel. My mother tried to soften things. Elena, you're not thinking clearly. You'll regret cutting ties with your own family. But I had never been clearer. What about all the money? My mother suddenly blurted out, her mask of concern slipping. You can't just cut us off financially. We depend on that help. And there it was, the truth, naked and unapologetic. It wasn't about grief or reconciliation or even appearances. It was about the checks I signed every month, the bills I covered without hesitation. I've canceled everything, I said. Your car insurance, your health supplements, your credit card payments, Lila's phone bill, her car payment, her gym membership. Every single one. You are on your own now. Tears slid down my mother's face, real this time. We can't afford all that, Elena. We're retired. We live on a fixed income. You had $8,000 for a vacation, I reminded her coldly. Figure it out. They looked at me as though I had become a stranger, when in reality, I had simply stopped being their safety net. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by Lila's shrill threats. I'll get a lawyer. You can't do this to us. But I had already done it. They left in a storm of slammed doors and shouted accusations, Lila screaming about betrayal, my father muttering about family loyalty, my mother sobbing into her hands. Trent trailed behind them, silent, ashamed. I locked the door behind them and leaned against it, my chest rising and falling with something that wasn't grief. It was relief. For the first time in years I felt lighter. I had severed the chains that kept me tethered to people who only took, never gave. 2 weeks passed. They tried calling from different numbers, sending emails, even leaving letters in my mailbox. I blocked them all. I didn't answer the door when they came pounding in the night. I refused to let their poison seep back into my life. Then Lila made a mistake. She posted on Facebook, painting herself as a victim. She wrote about how cruel I was, how I had evicted my pregnant sister and abandoned my elderly parents. She described me as unstable, vindictive, broken. Her friends rushed to her defense, horrified by the picture she painted of me. But then others, people who had been at Jonah's funeral, neighbors who knew Mika, teachers who remembered his smile, began to speak up. She wasn't at her nephew's funeral, someone commented. Neither were her parents. The tide began to turn. Truth has a way of crawling to the surface even when buried under lies. For the first time I realized I didn't even need to defend myself. Their own choices were doing the work for me. The morning after Lila's post, my feed pulsed like a wound. Reactions stacked in frantic colors. Outrage, pity, advice from people who love drama more than truth. I scrolled past paragraphs that named me selfish, unstable, heartless. It would have been easy to fight, to explain, to turn my grief into evidence. Instead I wrote one sentence and pressed send. Lila, the rift began when you, Trent, and our parents chose a beach over my child's funeral. And when you told me his death was my problem, not yours. That was all. No more, no less. The comments sat there like a lit match. Then the tide turned. Mrs. Doyle, who had read Mika's star poem through tears, replied first. I was at the service. Lila wasn't. Jonah's co-worker wrote about carrying the casket. Marisol posted a photo of the program, my handwriting smudged where I had cried on it. Neighbors added their memories. Mika's shy hello, his way of handing out Halloween candy like he was donating gold. People began to ask the only question that mattered. Where were you? The thread bloomed and then curdled. Lila shot back with half-truths, claims of miscommunication, a doctor-ordered rest, that somehow looked like cocktails at sunset. My mother jumped in to chide everyone for public disrespect, only to be met with quiet, surgical replies from those who had stood by me with casseroles and folded chairs and the silent labor of love that doesn't need a caption. I didn't answer again. Silence can be a boundary. Silence can also be a verdict. I put my phone face down on the table, made tea, and watched the steam rise like a tiny absolution. I had told the truth once. It was enough. By evening, the post vanished. Deletion is an admission dressed as tidiness. But screenshots have their own stubborn life. The thread reappeared in neighborhood groups, private messages, even a text from a woman I barely know. "I'm so sorry." I believed her at first. I should have known better. Trent sent a message that read like someone peering from behind a curtain. "I didn't know she said that to you. I'm sorry for my part." I stared at it until the words lost shape. Apologies, like medicine, need dosage and timing. This was late and faint. I let it pass through me without stopping. My mother called from 3 numbers I didn't recognize and left a voicemail with her old, familiar scold. "You've humiliated us. Family matters don't belong online. Call me to fix this." The irony made me dizzy. She had refused to stand at Mika's grave to avoid losing vacation vouchers, and now she worried about losing face. I blocked the new numbers. At the grocery store 2 days later, I turned into the cereal aisle and nearly collided with my parents. Hector's mouth opened, then closed. Maureen lifted her chin like armor. For a second, my body remembered being their daughter, the one who changed light bulbs and paid premiums and brought over soup. Then the memory dissolved. "We should talk," my mother said, voice taut. "We did," I answered. "You chose what mattered." Her eyes searched my face for the old softness. She found something else. I pushed my cart past them, turned out of the aisle, and left without buying anything. In the parking lot, I sat behind the wheel and waited for my hands to stop shaking. They did, faster than I expected. The truth was setting, like concrete, like sunrise. I didn't feel righteous, I felt finished. Grief needs places to live. I made it a box. Sandalwood, smooth at the edges, large enough to hold the things that made and unmade us. A photo of Jonah with fish scale glitter on his jeans. Mika's lopsided science fair ribbon. A movie stub from a night we stayed for the credits to guess who best boy actually was. I tucked the box on the top shelf of my closet where it could keep watch. Then I did the accounting of my life, the literal kind and the other kind. I made a list, not of bills canceled but of boundaries built. No more funding crises born from carelessness. No more apologies for having limits. No more defending my grief to people who never earned a front row seat. I visited the cemetery at dusk when the air felt less cruel. I spoke to the ground as if it listened. "I am going to make something beautiful with what's left," I promised. I left a baseball on Mika's stone, the one he called lucky, green stitches missing in 2 places, and a folded letter under a small, flat rock. Words I'd never send to Lila because they were wasted there. At North Mercy, I asked Dr. Saito if there was a way to put Mika's name somewhere that mattered. Weeks later, a tiny placard appeared on a bookshelf in the pediatric wing. "Mika's Corner, for big questions and brave readers." I stocked it quietly. Space books, a field guide to the moon, a novel about a kid who learns to map the night. I did not tell my family. Gifts do not need witnesses to be real. On the way home, the sky broke open with stars as if agreement. I breathed in and out and let the air count for me. 1 for Jonah, 1 for Mika, 1 for the woman I was becoming. The downtown loft smelled like primer and lemon oil. I had hired painters to erase the last fingerprints, to uncurl the corners of Lila's posters, to return the walls to a calm that didn't flinch. Light pooled across the floorboards in wide, generous swaths the way it had when Jonah first showed me the place, his grin saying, "Can you imagine?" I interviewed tenants at the small cafe on Riverstone Avenue, listening for steadiness, for the sound of people who knew how to care for something that wasn't theirs. I found them in Noah and Priya, 2 teachers with ink on their fingers and a habit of finishing each other's sentences without interrupting. We signed papers, and their relief was a gentle, grateful thing that lifted the room. Market rate, direct deposit, clear expectations. No back doors for guilt to sneak through. I boxed what remained of my old life at work. Photos, a chipped mug with a whale on it, a ficus that had given up and come back twice. I turned in my resignation with a steady hand. "Time," I told my boss, who had been kinder than policies required. "I need a different kind of time." I bought a second-hand suitcase with a scuffed corner and a good zipper. I booked flights with money that once covered other people's everything. I flew to islands and alleys and high places, walked a cliff path where the ocean argued with rock, Learned to order breakfast in a city whose vowels felt like silk, counted cranes in a temple garden where wind rearranged prayer like confetti. I didn't post much. I kept most of it like a secret between me and the world. The taste of a tart apple under a stone arch, a stranger's dog asleep against my boot, the sound of a train slipping into mountains like a held breath released. Everywhere I went, I practiced being someone who belonged to herself. When the tickets were spent and the suitcase zipper began to sulk, I came home to Harborview for a while and discovered I was no longer at home. Grief had not left. It had learned to move without scraping. Love had not vanished. It had widened into something that included the woman in my mirror. One afternoon, skimming listings on a whim, I found a small house in Cedar Ridge, a mountain town where the air looked like a clean promise. The pictures were plain: pine boards, a stubborn fireplace, windows that opened onto sky, but something in me answered back. I drove up for a weekend and stood in the yard while wind moved the trees like a chorus that already knew my name. The realtor spoke square footage and comps. I listened for something else. The sound of a life that didn't require forgiveness to function. I made an offer. It was accepted with a speed that felt like blessing. In the weeks that followed, I packed with a gentleness I hadn't known I could afford. I gave away what should belong to other lives, kept what deserved to cross the mountain. Mika's corner bookplate template, Jonah's compass, the sandalwood box. I wrote a letter to my parents and didn't mail it. I wrote a shorter one to Lila and didn't either. Some letters are not for the recipients. They're for the sender finally telling the truth. I placed both letters in the box and closed the lid. People ask if I miss my family. I miss the myth sometimes, the glossy version I invented to survive. But I do not miss the calculation of their love, the invoices hidden inside their kindness. I am learning that family is an action, not a blood test. It's the neighbor who shovels your steps without ringing the bell, the nurse who leaves a cinnamon candy at your elbow, the friend who sits in silence and calls that help. The day I signed for the house in Cedar Ridge, a hawk circled above the trees as if drawing a boundary I could live inside. I stood in the doorway and said, "We're here," and for the first time since the knock at my old door, the word we felt right again. Me, the memories, the wide, necessary future. It was late autumn in Cedar Ridge when the knock came again, a sound so similar to that night years ago that my breath stuttered. My body remembered before my mind did. Doorbells mean devastation. But this time it was different. When I opened the door, it wasn't uniformed strangers with sorrow rehearsed in their mouths. It was Marisol, my oldest friend, holding a basket of bread she had baked herself. Her smile was soft, uncertain. I was passing through and thought, maybe you'd want company. For a heartbeat, my instinct was to protect my solitude, to keep the silence I had learned to cradle. But then I thought about what Mika's teacher once told me: community isn't a noun, it's a verb. I let her in. We sat by the stubborn fireplace while the mountain wind rattled the windows. She told me about her children, about her plans to start a small bakery, about the way grief had also carved holes in her life when she lost her brother. I listened, surprised at how natural it felt to share air with someone again. When she left, the house no longer felt quite so cavernous. It was as though her laughter had hung back, daring me to believe that walls could hold warmth again. I stood by the door long after she drove away, realizing that maybe the world was offering me a different kind of family, one built not by blood but by choice. Winter arrived with sharp edges. Snow turned the mountain roads into folded paper, but the view outside my window was breathtaking. Trees wearing white crowns, skies painted in pale fire at dusk. I began making small rituals. Morning tea on the porch wrapped in a blanket. Evening walks where the crunch of snow under my boots felt like punctuation. I joined the library committee, shelving books in a room that smelled of cedar and ink. Children would tumble in after school, their cheeks red from the cold, their voices spilling over each other as they searched for stories. One afternoon, a boy no older than Mika had been sat at a table frowning at a puzzle. I bent down, pointed to the corner piece and said, "Try this one." His grin when it fit made something in me loosen, something I thought had died. I realized joy wasn't gone. It was shy, waiting for me to call it back. At night, I wrote letters to Jonah and Mika. Not prayers, not desperate pleas, but updates. I fixed the fireplace. I made soup that actually tasted good. I laughed today and it didn't feel like betrayal. I placed each letter in the sandalwood box. It became less of a tomb and more of a bridge. Slowly, carefully, I was building a new life, one brick of kindness at a time. One evening while sorting through boxes, I found the unsent letter to my parents. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the words were still sharp, carved in ink like wounds that hadn't healed. You abandoned me when I needed you most. You chose money, convenience, and appearances over love. I release you not because you deserve it but because I deserve peace. Reading it again, I felt no urge to mail it. The letter had done its job the moment I wrote it. It had pulled the poison out of me. My parents still sent occasional emails, always practical. Can you reconsider? The holidays aren't the same without you. Not once had they said, we're sorry. Not once had they spoken Mika's name. I deleted the emails without opening them fully. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes forgiveness is simply the decision to stop carrying someone else's weight. I slipped the letter back into the box, closed the lid, and whispered to myself, I'm free. The room felt lighter, as though even the walls approved. By spring, the town no longer felt borrowed. People greeted me by name at the market. The librarian waved when she saw me coming down the street. Neighbors stopped to chat about weather and wood stoves, simple conversations that stitched me into their fabric. Marisol visited often, and one afternoon she brought her daughter, a teenager with bright eyes who carried a guitar. She played softly while we sat on the porch, mountain wind weaving through the strings. For the first time in years I sang along. My voice cracked, but nobody laughed. That night I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was belonging. These people didn't owe me anything, yet they showed up. That was what family meant. I donated more books to Mika's corner at the hospital. A nurse sent me a photo of two children reading under its plaque, their heads bent close together. I cried, but this time the tears weren't jagged. They were cleansing, like rain washing dust off glass. Jonah had once said, real wealth isn't money, it's who shows up when it storms. I finally understood. My family wasn't gone. It had simply changed its shape. On my 39th birthday, I hiked to the ridge above town where the sky stretched like an endless canvas. I carried no phone, no camera, just myself. I stood there, breathing in the thin, sharp air, and let the silence speak. I thought of Jonah's laugh, Mika's endless questions, the way their love had filled me like sunlight through stained glass. I thought of the cruelty that followed, the betrayals that cut deeper than any accident. And I thought of the clarity grief had left behind. Family isn't inherited, it's chosen again and again by those who show up. I whispered their names into the wind, imagining the sound carried across mountains and valleys until it reached wherever they were. Then I whispered my own name as though introducing myself to the world anew. Elena. Still here. Still rising. For the first time in years, the word didn't feel hollow. It felt like a beginning. I turned back down the trail, the mountain at my back, the town waiting below, and a future wide as the horizon ahead. The knock on my door years ago had ended one life. But it had also forced me to build another. One rooted not in obligation but in truth. And in that truth I discovered something priceless. The freedom to walk forward unburdened, the strength to carry love without chains, and the peace of finally being home.